Welcome to Vision and Values, a production of Bellevue University's Center for American Vision and Values. I'm John Muller, the Chancellor of Bellevue University, and with me today are our distinguished guests, Ed Rauhut, the Director of the Center for Vision and Values, and John Fund, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, who has had a long career in journalism. He actually started as a research analyst for the California State Legislature, and now writes On the Trail column for the Journal's online publication. And John, maybe my initial question is that we see in polling, and this is going back almost a generation, of declining faith in government, increasingly a mistrust for government. It certainly seemed quite evident in the latter years of the most recent Bush administration. My question is, within the halls of Congress, how do you see this whole process going forward?
Well, I think historically, Americans have always had a suspicion of centralized government, national government with its power center in Washington. And the New Deal set in motion a range of intellectual and political trends that I think are now being questioned. The reason is we've probably reached the limits of Washington's competence to direct our lives and to improve matters. And that's played out in the healthcare battle, because what the healthcare reform battle is really all about is, can a one-size-fits-all solution dictated from Washington solve the problems of people who have infirmities or health concerns, in their daily lives? And increasingly Americans are saying, no, it's not that they like insurance companies, it's not that they think that insurance companies run healthcare or HMOs run healthcare as well as they should, but they instinctively suspect that the same government that can't control and the federal budget is probably not going to be able to create a healthcare system that won't bankrupt the country. So I think the suspicion starts with Washington, and there's obviously concern that state government isn't working, that local government isn't working, but there's a general sense that government that's closer to the people is probably doing less damage and can be more influenced by average citizens.
Now, here's a really radical but simple suggestion. Within this culture, within Washington, does anybody ever say, well, why don't we prove we can cut healthcare costs and then reinvest that in expanded coverage?
Well, the answer is, those who have thought about that know the answer is no. They can't. Name the government program at the national level that came in under budget. When Medicare started, we had the best minds in the government predict what its growth rate would be. And in 1965, the prediction was that Medicare would cost in 1990 about $10 or $11 billion. It ended up coming in at $95 billion, 9 times what was projected. So with that track record, I think you see the people pushing the health care bill, supported by Obama and Pelosi and Reid, have decided the only way they can sell this as controlling health care costs is to fudge the numbers. The Congressional Budget Office does a very good job with the numbers, but they can only deal with the premises that you put in front of them. There's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out in computers. Same thing in budgeting. The health care bill that's before Congress right now takes 10 years of tax revenue from all of these higher taxes and pays for 6 years of benefits. The taxes begin immediately. The benefits don't begin for 2, 3, 4 years down the line. So obviously you're going to save money. If I tell someone, you can get 10 years of groceries, but you're only going to have to pay for 6 years worth, boy, you've saved money. The only problem is eventually the bill comes due.
Well, let me come back with something that's always fascinated me, and maybe you have an insight into this, and does it say something about our overall national psyche? But that is, government seems to have a unique genius to take failure and say, because we failed, we need more money, and they succeed. Now, how is it that they can keep coming back with the same story and continue to get more funding?
Well, it depends how you measure commitment. Government measures commitment usually one way, how much money you're spending. Otherwise, you don't care enough. Education. There are no studies that I know of that show there is a direct correlation beyond a certain minimal amount that shows that the more you spend on education, the better educational outcome you get. In fact, the states that spend the most on education, New Jersey, Connecticut, DC, the District of Columbia is the worst example, have often results that are worse than the rest of the nation. The states that spend the least, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, perhaps even Nebraska, they often have much better educational outcomes. So clearly, just spending money doesn't get you better results. You know, there was a judge in Kansas City a few years ago who dictated
that was a dramatic example.
Exactly. Dictated that, you know, there should be, every school should have a state-of-the-art track. Olympic-sized swimming pools, all kinds of cultural enrichment. But now, the city of Kansas City is in such perilous condition in terms of its education, they're thinking about closing half of their schools and basically just giving up the process. So the answer to your question is, if we measure our compassion, our commitment, our ability to try to solve a problem by how much we spend, we're using only one measurement. What really matters is whether or not you have a structure that actually expects the best of people, that holds people accountable, that demands responsibility, that demands results. Do you have values undergirding that system that support success? Or do you have values that perpetuate failure? Do you have expectations of people that while you're trying to help them, you also expect them to help themselves? You have to meet, each side has to meet each other halfway. If you just spend money on a problem, well, you're often just sending it down a failed system and you'll get more failure. But government doesn't think in those terms because I think government has a limited vision. We all have limited vision, but the beauty of our country has been through our diversity and through the mediating structures that we've created to stand between the individual and the government, you know, the churches, the philanthropic institutions, the universities. We have a variety of approaches to try to solve problems, starting at the local level and moving up. Government is a one-size-fits-all thing. It knows how to write checks very well, but it doesn't know how to change human behavior. It doesn't know how to inspire human behavior for the better in most cases, except perhaps in times of war. So I think government has a very limited vision of what can be done to make things better, and it's usually just spending more money, and that's a very cramped, limited vision.
Is there a national model of healthcare somewhere in the world that is cost effective and that does deliver quality and service?
Sure, but it probably can't be sustained without bankrupting the society that's paying for it. Because, as you know, in every industrial society, more and more people are growing older, there are fewer children being born, and gradually there are fewer and fewer people to pay the bills. So I think fiscally they're heading towards a crisis because all of the industrial systems in the world that I think deliver a fairly good set of healthcare results, France, Germany, they're ultimately going bankrupt. Britain's system doesn't work on any level because Britain's system delivers often substandard care at the same time that it's going bankrupt.
So there is no cost-effective system.
The closest is probably Switzerland. It's not the system I would pick for this country. It is a system of mandatory insurance, but it's private. It's all done through private insurance companies, and it's all done with the maximum degree of patient choice. And there is some competition because people, when they select their insurance policies, they select them from a range of products. So I would say of all the systems that come closest, I think, to a workable model of national health care, it's probably the Swiss, but even that system is eventually going to have to change because of the fiscal pressures on it.
So among them all, then, the most successful is the one that's also the most competitive.
Yes.
So what you seem to be saying then is, or at least what I'm hearing now, is that this healthcare push is not so much about healthcare.
It's about power.
It's about power.
Right. Look, the people who want government to hold a bigger share of the national income, who want to exercise more control over the citizenry, For them, health care is the easiest way to make more Americans dependent on government for basic services. We already have people, 90% of people are dependent on government for the education of their children because we provide public schools. They're increasingly dependent on government for jobs. More and more people, you know, we lost 9 million jobs in this last recession. Government employment went up 100,000. So we're more and more dependent on the government for jobs. Healthcare is already a mixed system. 50% of healthcare dollars are spent by government in some way or another.
Sure.
But if healthcare can be turned into a nationalized model, that means the competition in politics is between how many benefits you can give out in a ration system. Because remember, we are going to ration healthcare. Healthcare wants are infinite. We ration by price largely now. You know, what kind of insurance you have, what does your insurance pay for if you don't have insurance. We obviously make it difficult for you to get health care because you have to go through clinics or emergency rooms. And that has a system that's many flaws. We need to fix that. I believe as many people as possible should have access to health care. I think we can move a whole lot closer to that model. But having government give that as a right and having government dictate what the benefits are will lead us to a different kind of rationing, which is rationing by waiting time, rationing by less technology, less innovation, fewer drugs reaching the market, because government does have to save money because these healthcare systems always, as I mentioned with Medicare, cost a lot more than envisioned. And that's what we've seen and over again. It's instead of rationing by price, we have rationing by government bureaucratic dictate.
Few, if any, medical innovations have come out of countries with a national healthcare system because there simply is not an incentive.
You get some medical device, yeah, but largely the United States is the model for medical innovation, and that's why so many people come here to go to medical school. It's why so many of the top researchers end up here. It's why Canadians come here, because they have a national healthcare system that often has very long waiting lines for many procedures, so they come here. In fact, the Prime Minister of Newfoundland just came to the United States for heart treatment.
There you go.
And he was unapologetic. He said, it's my life, it's my heart, it's my family, I'm going to go where the best care is. And apparently that's not in Canada.
John, going back to this whole gridlock issue and loss of public confidence, how do you see the Tea Party related to that? What are they really saying? How do you see that whole thing developing and its implications?
I think the Tea Party is in a long tradition of social movements in this country that has had a profound effect on American politics and society without becoming formalized. A movement that has one single leader or one single mission or runs candidates for office. The anti-war movement in the 1960s had a profound effect on this country, even though it was never part of a formal political structure. The pro-life movement had a profound effect on this country after Roe v. Wade, even though it didn't have a formal leader or had ran candidates in its own right. The Tea Party is no one group of people. It's millions of disenfranchised Americans who feel government is no longer listening to them, who say we have to do something about this. And whether it's protesting, whether it's attending rallies, whether it's talking to friends and neighbors, whether it's reinvigorating discussion of the Constitution as the document that should animate our politics. Tea Partiers don't belong to any one party. Many of them have never been involved in politics before, but they're concerned patriotic Americans, and they say, look, if things don't change, if we continue to go along this trajectory of more and more debt, more and more spending, we're going to lose the country we had. And you know, one of the things that has always animated Americans is the belief that we will hand down to our children and our grandchildren a country that is better and more prosperous than the one we lived in. And right now, that basic American proposition, which I think is a fundamental tenet of American exceptionalism, is in jeopardy. 65% of Americans now say they aren't sure or don't believe they will hand down a country that is better and more prosperous to their children and their grandchildren. I think that's the biggest single thing that's animating the Tea Partiers, worrying that this country will not be as great as it has been and as great as they wanted it to be for their children and grandchildren.
So is their issue primarily one of debt that we're passing on to our grandchildren? Are they worried we're reaching a tipping point where servicing the debt consumes such a large portion of our resources, that we'll never have a really vibrant economy again?
I don't think we can generalize from a group as inchoate as the Tea Party movement, but it's part of that. But I think it's a sense that the basic balance of control between the government and the individual has been upset. And the government is no longer listening to us, even though we're supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That a narrow bureaucratic elite has seized control of the basic decision-making process in Washington, is going to do whatever it wants, regardless of what people think. That's what drives people crazy about the healthcare debate. How many times and in how many different ways have the majority of the American people expressed their opposition to the basic tenets of this Obama healthcare bill? And yet, right now, as we speak, they're trying to push it through. Massachusetts voted against it indirectly, Virginia, New Jersey, and it seems as if our leaders are no longer listening to we the people.
But what I see too is this exponential growth of government is something that we saw during the Bush administration, and certainly is something that's going on right now. And the message that I'm hearing from the Tea Party folks is a message of limited government.
Yes, and also the Bush administration, despite the fact that it was spendthrift and despite the fact that there were the earmark scandals, it did not depart from a post-war consensus since the end of World War II of what the size of government would be within rough boundaries. Roughly, from World War II to today, the federal government has consumed between 18 and 20% of our gross national product, and it's taxed about 16 or 17%, and the difference is a deficit, which isn't good, but it's manageable. Obama has broken apart that post-war consensus and moved the growth of government to a whole new level. Right now, the government is consuming about 24% of gross domestic product. It's taxing, 18, 19%, and the difference is this enormous growing deficit. I mean, what is it? Something like 40% of what the federal government is spending this year is debt. That's unsustainable. They recognize that. I think what's driving that is a desire to increase the level of taxation in this country dramatically, which I think will retard economic growth. And I think ultimately what the Obama people had in mind, if they had succeeded in everything they wanted to do, is create a deficit so large that we all know it's difficult to cut spending, that then they could introduce a value-added tax, which is the tax that every European country does.
Sure.
And a value-added tax not to replace other taxes. There's been a debate in this country, we should scrap our horrific, horrible, disgraceful income tax system with a fair tax or a flat tax. What the Obama people had in mind is, we'll keep the horrible income tax we have, riddled with loopholes and exemptions and unfairness, and we'll add a value-added tax, which would be a hidden sales tax, which would be embedded in the price of every product. So the fact that it's hidden makes it much easier to raise it. I mean, I grew up partly in Europe. I can remember my Danish relatives telling me that when the VAT, the value-added tax, came in the late 1960s in Denmark, you know what the rate was?
No.
6%. You know what the rate is today?
No.
22%. It's a ratchet. It only moves in one direction. It's not good that the federal government is a fifth of our national economy, but we lived with it and prospered and did fairly well. But if we take it up to a quarter or to a third, we're a different country.
Yes.
And we're a country with much less opportunity for our children, much less economic growth. And this deficit commission that Obama has, by the way, it will report on December 1st. Interesting, that's only 3 weeks after the election. So they don't want to give the bad news before the election. The deficit commission Obama has appointed will report on December 1st. Congress will still have a month to run before the new Congress comes in. I think the plan perhaps is have the deficit commission report, we need new taxes, have the lame duck Congress, which will be much more democratic than the one coming in, pass those taxes, and it'll largely be a political cost-free vote for them because many of them will be retiring or have been defeated.
John, at a dinner the other night for friends of the university, someone brought up the issue of the Cornhusker kickback. Let's take a look and see what you had to say about that issue.
John, I want to thank you for gracing the Cornhusker State with another visit. And since we've brought up the Cornhusker kickback a few minutes ago, would you talk a little bit about how you think that that's affected not only public opinion across the country, but how that affects the passage of the bill?
Look, these deals go on in Congress all the time, but not something this visible with something that affects 1/6 of the economy and something as personal as health care. It was sleazy. I know why Ben Nelson did it. He basically concluded, they're beating up on me so much I'm going to have to vote for it, I might as well get something for it. I don't think he was malevolent about it. He had leverage, so he thought he'd use it. He thought he'd be rewarded for it. How's that working out for him? I heard about him being booed as he was leaving an Omaha restaurant. This is not exactly how you want your constituents to think of you. It's interesting that the Cornhusker kickback became so toxic that every Democrat says it now has to get out of the bill. And that's one of the reasons why House members are going to have trouble voting for the Senate bill, because the original Senate bill still has that in there. And if they're going to make them walk the plank, it's going to include that. I think the people of Nebraska did a wonderful thing by standing up and saying, we don't want to be associated with this embarrassment. This does not represent the values of our state, and he is not speaking for us. I think he made an impact. And I think it made an impact because it's one thing for people around the country to be mad. It's another thing for the intended beneficiaries of that special deal to say, we don't want a part of it. So my hat's off to you.
Shift the gears a little bit again and come back to public opinion polls, the Tea Party movement, and real concerns about general ethics in business and politics and so forth. And yet we're in a world where we spin more than we ever did. We try to spin earlier than we ever did. We try to get out in front of everything. And the public is increasingly turned off by this. My curiosity here is, within the halls of Congress, where they're all busy spinning, is there a sub rosa off-the-record conversation? Are they concerned about this?
We have an adversarial political culture. One party is not going to say, well, here we are, warts and all, and the other party is not going to say, here we are, mistakes and successes. Obviously, both parties put together the best argument they can for their point of view, and they try to exclude the arguments against them. I think what you're referring to is the fact that I think we probably had more substantive policy disagreements in Congress in the past, and now it's a lot. The posturing has grown even greater than before, and the propaganda has grown even greater than before. And I think that's one of the reasons why both parties have discredited themselves. I guess the reason they do it is a lot of our problems are intractable, and they don't have the political courage to address them directly. The problems of our entitlement, the problems of our debt, the problems of our national security, and how to fight terrorism. So as a substitute for that, you posture and you preen, and you go into sound bites, because it's a substitute for serious thought and real legislative work. Now, as long as you get away with that and you get reelected, I suppose it works for them. I'd like to think that our problems are big enough, and the Obama administration has put those in relief sharply enough that we're going to see a political reaction this November. And maybe people will say, we want grown-ups running things. We want adults having adult conversations. For all of its faults, Obama's healthcare summit was a serious effort to discuss issues in polite terms between people. Obviously there was posturing, but there was also substance. And I think if people had watched that whole thing on C-SPAN or the networks, they would have learned something about the reasons why both political parties can't agree on a single healthcare approach, but why there are fundamental philosophical disagreements. So I think that was useful. And I think the reason they had that healthcare summit was in part because all that had previously followed had just been a relentless push to propagandize the issue and have sound bites. So I think eventually people are getting tired and demanding more substance. And I think it's because our problems are now big enough, people realize we've got to get a grip on them.
So do you see a real crisis coming? I mean, are we in the canoe heading over Niagara Falls? Or do you think we can pull back from the precipice?
It depends what you view as a crisis. I think if we don't change our direction, we know what's going to happen. In 2015, Medicare runs out of money. Another 5 or 6 years, Social Security runs out of money. Medicaid is eating the state budgets alive. It is growing at double-digit rates of growth. And we also have our debt. The Chinese are now giving us lectures on fiscal responsibility and conservatism. This is a communist government. that is lecturing us with validity as to our profligate ways. And eventually, as we've seen with Greece and other countries, and our states like California, eventually you reach a point where people won't accept your bonds, won't accept your debt. So I don't know where the cliff is or how close we are to going over it, but I know we will eventually reach it, and probably sooner rather than later if we don't have a fundamental change of course.
John, we thank you for your many thoughtful comments. As a society, there are a lot of really important issues out there that we still need to think through as a society and deal with them going forward. So I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and we certainly thank you for being with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.